Good day. As of the time of making of this video, there's been no further news about the festering crisis between Serbia and Kosovo, or shall we say between Serbia and its breakaway province of Kosovo, depending on your political perspective of that conflict. I don't think that the conflict is resolved. The Russians have said that they've not yet received any formal request of help from Serbia, but at the same time they've made it very clear that they are watching the situation closely, as of course the West is. I think that this is a continuing situation. I think escalation is highly likely. I will return to this topic when there is more news. In the meantime, I will continue with my discussion of that other great crisis that we've been now confronting in Europe since the conflict, the fighting between Russia and Ukraine began in earnest in February. Though, of course, as the Russians never cease to remind everybody, this conflict has actually been underway in one form or another ever since the Maidan events of February 2014 and the change of government in Ukraine, which took place as a consequence of those events. Anyway, let me begin with my usual traditional summary of the military situation. And there's been a great deal of news, but most of it, I have to say, has been coming again from the Russian side. Now, firstly, there's now reports, not just from the Russians, by the way, but to some extent confirmed from the Ukrainian side as well, that Russian forces have advanced further and deeper into Bakhmut, that Ukrainian defense lines have been breaking, and that the fighting in Bakhmut is indeed entering what are probably its final stages. There's been more reports, by the way, of more bridges being destroyed close to Bakhmut. Supposedly, the Russians say by the Ukrainians to cover their retreat. I'm not going to speculate about who is responsible for the destruction of these bridges. But anyway, the fact is the fighting in Bakhmut continues. The Russians are pressing their advantage. They're moving deeper, ever deeper into the town. And as I've said previously, all the indications are that we are now moving towards a conclusion in this long, harsh battle. I would say that the Ukrainians have not given up. And there's been a report from TASS which quotes the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, one of the 4 breakaway regions from Ukraine, which has now joined Russia. And of course, the Donetsk People's Republic covers Donetsk region, which is the region in which Bakhmut is situated. So Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, is presumably very familiar with the situation, the nature of the fighting which is ongoing in Bakhmut. And on Russian television, Solovyov Live, on Tuesday, he's quoted as saying the following: near Artyomovsk, I should say Artyomovsk is the Russian name for Bakhmut. I'm going to continue to call it Bakhmut so long as the Ukrainians retain control over it. But returning to Pushilin's comments, near Artyomovsk, the enemy continues to commit more reserves to action, but all of its attempts to counterattack have failed. The Ukrainian military sustained heavy losses when young, mobilized and untrained reservists were sent to fight. They keep trying to use superiority in manpower, but it's getting ever harder for them. Their losses are too numerous to count. And there have been other Russian reports which claim that the whole of the eastern Ukraine, the hospitals in eastern Ukraine are now full of injured or wounded Ukrainian soldiers. Now, I want to stress again, these are Russian reports. One always has to take reports from one side about the fighting with a measure of caution. I can't independently corroborate them myself. I've not been to Bakhmut. I've not witnessed the fighting there. But we saw that over the previous couple of days, over the previous week, we've had a succession of reports specifically appearing in the British media, in the Financial Times, in The Economist, in The Guardian, and in the Daily Telegraph, all of which seem to confirm a deteriorating situation for Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, and all of which admit very heavy losses. Now, all of these British articles also spoke about very heavy losses by the Russians. And I would say that I read on the thread of one of my videos a comment by a viewer who said that, in fact, it's the Russians who suffered the heaviest losses in Bakhmut. Thousands, or I think he said tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed trying to capture Bakhmut, and thousands of Russian tanks, or hundreds of Russian tanks, have also been lost in the fighting there. Now, that is a claim I have seen. I'm going to say that I have issues with it, and they are very simple. They are these. If Russian losses in Bakhmut are as high as these reports claim, if there's hundreds of knocked out Russian tanks in and around Bakhmut, if there's hundreds or thousands of dead Russian soldiers in and around Bakhmut, why am I not seeing photographic and film evidence in a big way that confirms this? I see huge amount of evidence about Ukrainian losses, dead Ukrainian soldiers, knocked out Ukrainian tanks, that kind of thing. Admittedly, that comes from the Russian side, but I see nothing comparable in terms of scale from the Ukrainians pointing to Russian losses in and around Bakhmut. I would have thought that if it was indeed the case that thousands upon thousands of Russian soldiers had been killed around Bakhmut and hundreds of tanks had been knocked out there, that there would be much more photographic and video evidence that this was actually the case. Now, I just make that point. If people want to provide me with this evidence, let them do so, and I will try to assess it. But as of this time, the vast preponderance of evidence which I have seen points to very, very heavy Ukrainian losses, much heavier than those that the Russians are suffering, and that has to be the basis of my assessment of the situation there. Now, that's what the Russians are saying about the situation in Bakhmut. And as I said, reports of the Russians now fighting well inside, deep inside Bakhmut. It's no longer a case of the battle being fought out in the suburbs, in the industrial areas, around the town. All of that seems, as I said, to suggest that we're looking at some kind of an end game there. But it's not just in Bakhmut that the fighting is going on. Now, there's also been claims, and again, these are Russian claims, about the situation in Marinka. Marinka is this town, around 10,000 people, located near Donetsk, and we've now had a claim about it from the assistant interior minister of the Lugansk People's Republic, another breakaway region, Vitaly Kiselyov. And he is reported to have said on Tuesday that the Russian armed forces are taking charge of the liberated territory. These are his words. The road leading to Krasnogorovka, used for the Ukrainian army's supplies in Marinka, is under the control of the Russian armed forces. And Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, also said on Solovyov Live, same program in which he made those comments about Bakhmut, he said that Marinka will soon be liberated and the supply routes have been already been blocked there. That is why the situation for the enemy forces is not good there. And then we go on to read from TASS, this is the official Russian news agency, that the acting DPR head, that's Pushilin, earlier told TASS, this is in a separate interview from the one he gave on Solovyov Live, that the Marinka front was a priority area and that the fighting was already taking place inside the community. Well, that's something we've been knowing about for a long time. And then he goes on to say there was still Ukrainian army positions and strongholds inside the hamlet. Marinka is not a hamlet, it is a small town, but never mind, clearly the person who writes these things for TASS doesn't, or translates them, doesn't perhaps quite know what these words mean in English. But anyway, never mind. But the Allied forces are steadily liberating it. And Pushilin then goes on to say that the liberation of Marinka would place the settlement of Alexandrovka, the Petrovsky district, and the Tekstilchik neighborhood of Donetsk outside the range of the Ukrainian army's shelling. Well, that may or may not be true. It has been suggested that Ukraine could probably continue to shell Donetsk from quite a substantial distance with its long-range missiles, its HIMARS missiles, and that the loss of Marinka and even indeed of Avdiivka, the main place where Ukrainian forces are concentrated near Donetsk, even the capture by the Russians of these two places would not necessarily end the Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk. And in fact, the Russians, as it happens, have claimed that there's been very intense shelling of Donetsk by the Ukrainian army over the last 24 to 48 hours. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of long-range shelling and artillery, there's been more activity in Zaporozhye region. The Ukrainians blew up a bridge near Melitopol. It was apparently carried out by a group of saboteurs, Ukrainian saboteurs. It's clearly some sort of an attempt to interfere with the communications between the Russian forces in Zaporozhye and eastern Kherson region east of the Dnieper River, and Russian forces in Crimea. I'm going to say, and of course, by the way, just to add to that, Forbes magazine has now also published a piece which suggests that the Ukrainians are still considering their offensive in Zaporozhye, which is intended to move all the way to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea and to cut the land bridge to Crimea, the Russian established land bridge to Crimea, and to isolate the Russian forces in Kherson to, in effect, trap them. Well, I'm going to just say a few things about this. I think this is still possibly a plan that the Ukrainians are considering. I think this is going to be a very, very difficult plan to execute indeed. Unlike Kherson region west of the Dnieper, this is an area, Zaporozhye and eastern Kherson region, that is of vital importance to the Russians. It's a major communications node between Russia and Crimea. It is, of course, the land bridge. I would have thought that the Russians would be intent on defending it, quite apart from the fact that they now consider it Russian territory. The indications are that the Russians have moved substantial forces there, and they built elaborate defenses in this area. Even the Forbes article seemed skeptical that the Ukrainians would be able to pull it off. Now, the Ukrainians, going back to the Kherson offensive, as I've repeatedly pointed out, the Ukrainians never actually broke through Russian defenses in Kherson region. The Russians took a decision to withdraw their forces, which was one that General Surovikin made, because from his point of view, it made no sense to keep large numbers of Russian troops, some of Russia's best troops, marooned west of the Dnieper, where they were not doing much that was useful and where it was difficult to supply them. But the Ukrainians never broke through the Russian defenses in Kherson region. There was no great battle to recapture Kherson city, which the Ukrainians won. And as it turned out, even the Ukrainian attempts to knock out or do serious damage to the two big bridges across the Dnieper, the railway bridge over the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, and the Antonovsky Road Bridge, the damage was less extensive than was claimed, and the Russians actually withdrew a significant, or some of their troops at least, from Kherson region west of the Dnieper across the Antonovsky Bridge before they blew it up behind them. So it's going to be much more difficult for the Ukrainians to succeed, I would have thought, in Zaporozhye. The Russians will put up a fight here. They're much better supplied in this area. It's closer, much closer to Russia's main supply routes. There's not the great obstacle in the way of resupply that the Dnieper represented. And to be straightforward about this, I think the chances of this offensive succeeding, if it really is being planned, are very limited indeed. But anyway, it's possible, it's quite likely that the Ukrainians are giving some thought to it. Now, going on from this, there's been discussions about the present situation, condition of the Ukrainian armed forces. As I understand it, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who most probably does have information, reliable information available to him, which is not available to me, puts the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian ground forces, he gives their number as 190,000. Now, this is correct, and I'm not quite sure what that number means, by the way, whether this means just combat effective troops or the total number of troops in the Ukrainian army. I should say that obviously not including police, paramilitary formations and those sort of things. But anyway, if this is true, 190,000 men, whether these are combat troops or just troops in total, well, then at some point over the next few weeks and months, the situation that we saw in August and September, where the Ukrainians convincingly outnumbered the Russians on the ground, is going to reverse itself if it has not been reversed already. And at that point, the superiority in numbers that Ukraine has used, and which has been its main advantage in the fighting over the last few weeks, will not only have disappeared, it will have gone into reverse. And of course, Pushilin did say that the Russians, that the advantage that the Ukrainians had their superiority in Artyomsk, their numerical superiority in Artyomsk, that's declining, and that would be consistent with what we know. And I have to say, if the Ukrainian army is dwindling in number on that kind of scale, then that must also make an offensive in Zaporozhye region as even more problematic. My understanding is that most military analysts in the West are now becoming increasingly skeptical that this proposed offensive in Zaporozhye region is really viable as a plan. But, let's wait and see what Ukraine does. It may be that they will try to launch an offensive like this, if only to disrupt Russian plans. And we can't anticipate too precisely what the Ukrainians are going to do, because like the Russians, the Ukrainians keep their plans, to a certain extent at least, to themselves. Now, having said this, and about Ukraine running out of men, that might be questionable, but we've now had a long article in the Financial Times about Ukraine's growing problems in terms of its air defenses. And the article, which is in the Financial Times, says that the escalating air war, depletes Ukraine's weapons stockpile. And the article, what it basically says is that the Ukrainians are running out of surface-to-air missiles. Kiev is burning through its ammunition at an alarming rate as it faces down Moscow in a battle of dwindling stockpiles. I'm going to come to that in a moment. And then the article goes on to say that Ukraine is finding it very difficult to keep its ammunition and spare parts for its S-300 and Buk systems operating. Ammunition and spares for the S-300 and Buk systems, the mainstay of Ukraine's air defenses, are dwindling. And it then goes on to say that the Ukrainians typically fire 2 S-300s or Buks. These are Buk missiles at every Russian missile to improve the chances of interception by what is aging kit. Purchasing additional S-300 or Buk missiles from Russia, where they are produced, is impossible. Well, that's a statement of the obvious. Finding further available stock on the global market has proved difficult, apart from a batch obtained from Slovakia earlier in the war. And by the way, on that topic, the Russians claimed that they were able to destroy the S-300 system supplied to Ukraine from Slovakia. I can't obviously say whether or not that is true. And then there is some discussion in this Financial Times article about how effective, lots of claims about the effectiveness of Western systems. There's a rather odd piece here, for example. It says Germany's Gepard mobile anti-aircraft guns, of which Ukraine has received 30 so far, have proved highly effective in taking down drones and low-flying missiles. However, the Swiss government has refused to authorize exports of Gepard Swiss-made ammunition to a war zone, and there is no ready alternative. Now, I have to say, I find that a little bit strange, because if the Gepard isn't being provided with ammunition, how is it proving highly effective in taking down drones and low-flying missiles? Presumably, this is ammunition from German stocks, but is this even really true? Is this whole story about the effectiveness of the Gepard in this battle, in this war, is this really confirmed? Well, I haven't seen any previous confirmation to that. And I would say that this entire Financial Times article is riddled with Ukrainian claims about the air war, which are in fact controversial and disputed. It takes Ukrainian claims, for example, that they're shooting down most of the cruise missiles that the Russians are launching at Ukraine. It takes those claims as true. They might be, but as I've said, there's been in previous videos, there are problems with the arithmetic which call them into question, call those claims into question. It also repeats that trope going all the way back to March, that the Russians are also depleting their stockpile of cruise missiles, and that they can't keep this air war going because their stockpiles of cruise missiles are also running down. The trouble with that is that this claim has been made so often that it's starting to lose credibility. And of course, there were articles. There's been an article in the New York Times which basically confirms that the Russians are able to go on producing cruise missiles, and that most of the cruise missiles that are in fact striking Ukraine are in fact recent production, a fact which this Financial Times article does not mention. So anyway, there are these points there which, as I said, you could take issue with in this Financial Times article. But the big takeaway is that Ukraine is starting to run out of its Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles, its S-300s and its Buk missiles. And they have been the backbone of Ukraine's air defenses. And the article goes on to say that if Ukraine does indeed run out of missiles, air defense missiles, then things could get much worse for Ukraine. And the article points out that Britain's Royal United Services Institute warned in a report last month against Western complacency about the need to urgently bolster Ukrainian air defense capacity. It said that if Ukrainian surface-to-air systems ran out of ammunition, it would open the skies to Russian heavy bombers operating at medium and high altitudes with devastating consequences. Well, I have discussed in many programs, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done so as well, that the idea of replacing Ukraine's Soviet-era air defenses with Western air defenses is much more complicated than it might seem. The Western powers have never invested in air defense missiles and air defense systems to anything like the extent that the Russians have done, simply because the Western powers have never imagined up to now a war in which they did not possess air superiority. So it may not be easy to replace the Soviet-era systems that Ukraine uses with Western systems. Those Western systems may not exist in the quantities and at the qualitative level that the Financial Times would perhaps want to believe. And indeed, it does seem as if in this area, as well as in every other, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery shells, there's been a huge amount of discussion about this, both on this program and especially again on Brian Beletic's New Atlas. In every one of these areas, the Western powers are now struggling to keep up with Ukraine's needs. In fact, the EU Foreign Affairs High Representative Josep Borrell has actually admitted that most of NATO's European member states have basically run out of equipment that they can provide to Ukraine, and they're now indeed critically short of equipment to defend themselves. Anyway, there we go. So whether Colonel McGregor is right over Ukraine's manpower shortage, he may very well be. I'm not arguing with him. It does seem that over and above everything else, Ukraine is now facing an equipment shortage, and it's starting to impact its air defenses as well. And RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, says that if Ukraine runs out of air defense missiles, well, that could mean that Russia's bombers, its Tupolev 22M3 and bombers especially, I suspect, could be unleashed, and that might also have extremely devastating results. Anyway, to move on, I've discussed the military situation in Ukraine. I had expected yesterday that, with my long piece about Merkel yesterday, that would be the last I would say about Merkel's absolutely catastrophic Die Zeit interview. But I also said that this interview has now ricocheted around the world, that it's caused a disastrous impression in Russia, and it's now been picked up increasingly by other countries. And inevitably, a commentary about it has appeared in Global Times. Now, Global Times, as I've discussed many times, is a newspaper, a Chinese newspaper, owned by the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of China's Communist Party. And Global Times is, of course, a step further away from the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. But having said that, there's no doubt at all that it reflects closely Chinese government thinking. And Merkel's interview in Die Zeit has now resulted in a comment piece in Global Times, which I have no doubt reflects the thinking of China's government. One reason why I think that, by the way, is that it is a comment piece. It's not an editorial, but it's a comment piece which is published by Global Times. In other words, there's no named commentator. It's Global Times as a newspaper, its editorial board, if you like, which has written this comment piece, and that gives it even more authority than if it had been written by a specific commentator. And I'm going to read the entire article from Global Times, because I think it reflects what China thinks about this whole affair, but also I suspect it's also a view that's going to gain increasing traction around the world. And the article starts with the words, "Real intention behind Minsk agreements further destroys credibility of the West." And it's then followed, directly under that headline, there is a cartoon in which you see the Russian bear opening the door of its house, finding a tank with flames coming out. Obviously, it's a sort of tank full of fuel, which has been set on fire, literally at Russia's doorstep. And a little further distance away, there is a picture of Uncle Sam with a can of fuel. It's clear that it's Uncle Sam who's lit the fire. That's the cartoon that Global Times has published to accompany this particular article. But then, Continuing with the article itself, it says the following. From pushing for the Minsk agreements to inciting the ongoing conflict between Moscow and Kiev, the West is attempting to exhaust and contain a country which they deem as a rival through protraction efforts, be they explicit or inexplicit. It has never really generally regarded Russia as a dialogue partner. In an interview with the German newspaper Die Zeit last week, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel revealed the West's real intention behind its negotiation with Russia and Ukraine to promote a ceasefire in 2014. She admitted the Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukraine time and that Kiev had used it to become stronger. In response, Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Friday that Merkel's remarks were completely unexpected and disappointing. As the new US media New York Post pointed out, Putin felt betrayed by the West following the Minsk agreements. It has turned out that no one was going to implement the agreements, the Russian leader pointed out. The Minsk agreements intended to manage the Ukraine crisis and avoid escalating the conflict. Merkel actually confessed something Western politicians do not want to admit to about the Minsk agreements. They were just a stopgap to buy time for Ukraine and the West, and Western countries have never put real effort into resolving the differences with Russia over the Ukraine crisis. What the former German leader stated tears down the last remaining bit of the friendly mask some Western countries put on with Russia. In the eyes of some Western countries, Russia is just a diplomatic and political alien. Moreover, under the influence of Washington, some view Moscow as a so-called threat due to its huge military power and political system that does not meet the Western standard. As a result, these countries have never stopped suppressing Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Russia has always considered itself a European country, expecting to build trust with the West. Thus, it is understandable when Putin expressed disappointment and a sense of betrayal from Merkel's words. Russia's trust in the West has already fallen to a new low, and the West's hypocrisy has worn out Moscow's will to engage in an effective dialogue with the West, some experts noted. Now there is a question of trust on the agenda, and it is already close to zero, said Putin on Friday. Merkel's confession about the Minsk agreement also showed that some Western countries, particularly the US, do not honor contractual obligations at all. They can go back on their words so easily. The agreement the West wants is never about credibility, it is all about interests. An agreement is seen as useful by the United States when it can advance the country's interests. Otherwise, Washington is always ready to deny it. This is exemplified by the US's withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Washington also adopts a double standard to advance its allies' interests when carrying out the agreement. The US and several other Western countries have become defaulters in the international community. They dare to break their promises because they are protected by Western hegemony with the US at its core. Washington has already hijacked many other Western countries to join such a hegemony, creating and maintaining a distorted international order. It is anticipated that some US-led Western countries will keep using so-called values as an excuse to defend their collective hegemony and bully others under international rule and order in their favor. As long as such domination exists, the world will still be the victim of power politics rather than a place full of justice and fairness. Now, there's an awful lot in this comment piece. The first is that Global Times cuts to the chase. They have no time for suggestions. You know, the discussions I've had in my previous programs about whether or not Merkel really intended to implement the Minsk agreements. I mean, they just take it as read that she didn't, and that she was just stringing the Russians along, and that was what the Western powers always do. Now, there is here a very strong point directed at the Russians. Global Times makes the point to the Russians: you may think of yourself as a European country, you may want to be a part of Europe, you may have made sacrifices to try to make friends with the other countries in Europe, but the reality is that they will never accept you. They regard you as an alien, and they want to suppress you. Now, that's a point the Chinese have been making to the Russians for many, many years. I've seen commentaries in the Chinese media about this. It is a misconception, a fundamental misconception that many people in the West have, that it was the Russians who courted China after the end of the Cold War, and especially in the early Putin era. On the contrary, it was the other way round. It was the Chinese who have been working steadily to persuade the Russians that the Europeans are not really their friends, that they will never accept the Russians, that Russia's interests instead are in building its strategic partnership with China. And Global Times, the Chinese in other words, and we can be sure that this is also being said by the Chinese officials, Chinese diplomats to their Russian counterparts in private. The Chinese are saying in this comment piece, look, we were right. Look at how Merkel and the Western powers have played you. But the comment piece goes even further, because what it also says is you can't trust the West. You enter into agreements with them, but Western attitudes to agreements are purely functional. The West will stick with agreements only for so long as doing so serves or appears to serve Western interests. When agreements get in the way, the West simply drops them. It tears up agreements and moves forward with whatever objectives it has. So don't think, whoever you are, be it Russia or anyone else, implicitly China too, that the Western powers will abide by any agreements you enter into with them. It's quite a devastating piece. And of course, and last but not least, the obvious point implicit in the whole article, which is that in this conflict, in Ukraine, Russia is not the aggressor, as the Western powers ceaselessly claim. On the contrary, it is the victim. It is the country that was led into a conflict which it tried to avoid and which it was maneuvered into through the duplicity of the West. Quite a powerful comment piece, and one which, as I said, I think many people around the world outside the West will agree with. So a powerful comment piece, and by the way, it comes even as there are all sorts of murmurings under the surface that the Chinese are now quietly providing some kind of assistance to the Russians in terms of their of the conflict in Ukraine. I can't confirm this. I wonder whether these reports are true, but there are suggestions, for example, that lots of Russian aircraft have been seen going to Chinese airports, that they've been filling up with cargo. Nobody knows what is in that cargo, and they've been flying back with it to Russia. Now, it could be that cargo is weapons, or it could be just civilian goods, or it could be anything, quite honestly. But anyway, those reports have been circulating. And I would just say this: China is, of course, the biggest industrial and manufacturing power on the planet by far. If the Chinese were to decide at any point to commit fully to supporting Russia in this conflict, I'm not saying that's ever going to happen, by the way, and I'm not saying that the Russians are seeking it. I've seen no evidence of any of that. But if they ever do, if the Chinese turn on the production lines, if they churn out ammunition and tanks and whatever it is that the Russians want, well, to be straightforward about it, the problems that Ukraine has in terms of equipment shortages, and indeed the West has in terms of equipment shortages at the moment, as opposed to the Russians, well, they will pale in the face of the tidal wave of Chinese-produced machines and guns and shells and tanks and cruise missiles and drones and you know what that would be heading towards them. It would be comparable to what happened during the Second World War, when this vast flood of American production came into play and swept all before it. I'm not saying, I want to stress again, I'm not saying that that's what's happening or that that's going to happen, but it does seem to me, given that this is so, that reinforcing China's belief that Russia is the victim of this affair, that the Western powers were playing it, and that this was done ultimately in order to break the friendship between China and Russia, the strategic partnership with Russia and China. Well, doing that doesn't seem to me at all wise. So anyway, that's what Global Times is saying. That's what the Chinese clearly think about this affair. And as I said, it's been reported widely in other places. And for what it's worth, I think Mrs. Merkel made a huge mistake by giving that interview to Die Zeit and saying those things. I think that it has simply brought out into the open, as Global Times says, the extent of the West's game playing over the Ukraine crisis, even if my own interpretation of what Merkel said and my own belief about her intentions is marginally more sympathetic, as I've discussed in my two previous videos, than Global Times, the position that Global Times is taking. Anyway, I'm going to finish this video with one very last comment, and that's about this story that's now circulating all over the media, that Putin, embarrassed by the failures in Ukraine, has decided to call off his press conference, his annual press conference this winter. This originates from certain, perhaps not entirely clear comments by his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. But I'm going to read out the TASS report, which touches on this issue, and I'm going to suggest that perhaps all of those articles that Putin is cancelling his press conference because of his enormous embarrassment about the failures in the war, I'm going to suggest that that, frankly, is a gross over-interpretation of Peskov's words, and that it looks to me simply as if the press conference has been rescheduled from December to January because of a tight schedule. And anyway, I'm going to just read out what TASS says about this. And this is the dispatch in TASS, which, as far as I can see, triggered this whole spate of stories you're seeing all over the Western media now. And it says this: Putin's annual press conference won't take place until New Year. Now, the word until. In November, Peskov said that the dates of Putin's annual news conference and other major events would be known after the date of the address to the Federal Assembly was set. And then we go on to read, Russian President Vladimir Putin's annual news conference will not take place until the new year, but it is expected that the head of state will find an opportunity to talk to the media, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters on Monday. As for the annual press news conference, yes, there won't be one before the new year, but we expect that the president will still find an opportunity to talk to reporters as he does regularly, including during his foreign visits, Peskov said. At the same time, the Kremlin spokesman did not talk about the possible date of the head of state's address to the Federal Assembly. We will inform you in due time, he noted. In November, Peskov said that the dates of Putin's annual news conference and other major events would be known after the date of the address to the Federal Assembly was set. Now, these words, it must be said, are not completely clear. But for what it's worth, they do not seem to me to suggest that this press conference has been cancelled. Rather, it suggests that it's been postponed a few weeks because of a very tight schedule, which is unsurprising, a heavy workload as Putin and his officials prepare for his address to the Federal Assembly. That's the two houses of Russia's parliament. And that once that's been resolved, once that's been set, and once Putin's address is in some kind of shape, then the press conference can finally take place. In other words, what is being reported in the West as a cancellation is merely a postponement. Now, it is a fact that that means that in calendar terms, there will be no big press conference from Putin this year. But I can't really see that a postponement of just a few weeks, which is what this TASS story seems to me to say, though, as I said, its wording is not always entirely clear. But I can't see that a postponement of a few weeks is of any very great significance. As I said, it's obvious that Putin has been extremely busy over the last few weeks and months, indeed the whole of this year. I mean, I've tried to keep up with the various things that he's been doing. It's not surprising at all to me that two big events, the address to the annual assembly, if you like, the State of the Nation address, which he usually does in the winter, and the big mammoth press conference, which also happens at around the same time. It's not surprising if these still require work, and if, as a consequence, they've just been postponed for a few weeks. Obviously, it's perhaps unsurprising that some people in the media in the West have been trying to make play from this issue. But as I said, I don't think that the TASS dispatch and Peskov's words really justify that kind of interpretation, the kind of interpretation that's been spread. And note that Peskov doesn't seem to have used the word cancellation, which is the one you see in much of the commentary. And he seems only to be talking about a postponement until after the new year. Well, that's all I'm going to say about that non-issue. I mean, it seems to me a trivial affair, given the immensity of events that are taking place. But anyway, I thought I would just set the record straight based on what TASS says. Well, that's me for today. Slightly shorter video than some I've made recently, but still coming close to an hour. So much always to cover in this conflict. Anyway, there we are. There'll be more from me soon. Obviously, the Serbia-Kosovo affair is the one that perhaps causes the most concern, but we see what happens in the war, what happens in Bakhmut and Marinka, whether there is a Ukrainian advance from Zaporozhye, and obviously it's clear that there is growing problems. Ukraine is facing growing problems on multiple fronts. Perhaps it's clearly running short of weapon systems, including surface-to-air missiles now. And Colonel McGregor tells us it's running short of men as well, even as Russian forces seem to be continuing with their build-up of both. Well, as I said, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Remember that you can find all our videos on Locals, where we have our main community, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Rockfin, and Telegram, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and that you can also buy all the great things that you will find in our shop, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those wonderful things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.